news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. So today is primary election day in Kentucky and Georgia, but Kentucky particularly the most expensive Republican congressional primary in history because MAGA has targeted Kentucky Representative Tom Massie for removal. And that included Pete Hegseth coming to town to campaign for Ed Gelron and against Massie, to which Massie had this to say.
Well, first of all, it shows that I'm up in the polls. They wouldn't be sending the Secretary of War to my congressional district if I weren't. I think it also shows I'm tougher than Iran, and I don't even have a nuclear weapon. I mean, they are all in this race. It's basically a national race at this point, and that's because, I'm up there, I'm getting things done.
Ed Gelron had this to say about Mr. Massie and that contention.
To that I say this race is a referendum for sure. It's a referendum to see if coastal elite liberal Democrats can buy a seat in Congress under the guise of a rhino Republican who has served for 14 years and is nicknamed Miss Representative Massie. Our term limits Tom, depending on what county you're here in my district of 21 counties. He's got a problem for every solution. He continues to be the MVP of the squad. He won that in 2025, hands down. He's the front runner for 2026. It's a pretty low bar, as we say in Kentucky, when you get the endorsement of the New York Times, that left-wing liberal congressman from California, Ro Khanna, the Joey Behar, and the ladies from The View, and to put a bow on it, that Crockett lady from Texas. When you tell folks in Kentucky he's been endorsed by those folks, they are dumbfounded because he's had the top cover of mainstream media for years. He's their darling. Laura, it wouldn't surprise you to know the New York Times came here a few weeks back. They didn't even talk to me. They interviewed him, wined and dined him, and did a lovely article on him because they hate us. One other thing I want to add, he has shipped in a bunch of out-of-state, no-name, so-called Republican rhino congressmen because not one of the Kentucky congressional delegation will stand near him because he's kryptonite. He can get nothing done for the Commonwealth.
Well, or they don't want to have the Trump sights put on them the way that Lauren Boebert has now. By the same token, with all due respect to Mr. Gelron and Coulter, Massie's not only the most conservative member of Congress in the freedom and constitutional sense, but he's also the smartest. He graduated from MIT with a BS in electrical engineering and MS in mechanical engineering, and while there invented a haptic computer interface, founded a tech company in his dorm room, got dozens of patents, and made millions of dollars. Today, the tech he invented is used in surgical training, robotics, and molecular research, among others. I mean, he could be smart, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't, in a safe Republican seat, you couldn't have someone more aligned with America first, I suppose, would be the counter argument. That said, the idea he's the worst, always the hyperbole, the worst congressman in American history. A bit over the top. While he hasn't always afforded himself well, at least from my perspective, but I'm not a libertarian, he did oppose COVID lockdown policies and vaccine mandates and the massive pandemic spending. He is, like Rand Paul, usually hostile to corporate welfare and expansion of entitlement programs and government interventions in the economy. So it's a little bit more complicated than, of course, Trump and his supporters want to make it. But by the same token, the trend lines seem to indicate that Tom Massie is an underdog going into today's election. Now, on the other side, of course, you have the ongoing hue and cry, which will continue through the rest of this cycle, and then from November of 26 and through November of 28, you can be sure. And that is the impact of the remapping that's going on, as well as the Calais decision inspired remapping. And it's going to be wall-to-wall Jim Crow 2.0, Jim Clyburn with Tapper.
Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock said it was a, quote, 21st century version of Jim Crow in new clothes. Do you agree?
Absolutely, I agree.
And AOC.
Young man who was testifying against redistricting out in the South. And he said something very true, that MAGA is the last dying breath of the Confederacy. And it could not be more true.
You've gone from being insurrectionists to being Confederates, or maybe Confederates to insurrectionists, back to Confederates. It's hard to keep track. Deplorables to insurrectionists to Confederates to... Francis Parker Spice, Chicago's very own, at least high school educated, Ayanna Pressley.
There are people in this hostile anti-black administration that would rather black Americans pick cotton than pick the president, than pick their congressperson, than pick a senator.
Yeah, that's what you're going to be treated to. For more on all this, David Drucker, senior writer for The Dispatch, author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. David, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good to be here.
What's your sense of Thomas Massie's fate today?
Good question. I was out there a couple weeks ago, talked to a lot of different people that support him, people that oppose him. And I don't mean to overuse the cliche, it comes down to turnout, but I mean it in this way. What even Republican activists and operatives in the district told me was that if every single registered Republican showed up to vote today, early voting, mail-in voting, and in-person voting, there are plenty of votes to defeat Thomas Massie in a primary with Ed Galvin, who's, your run-of-the-mill Republican with a good resume, and, he's kind of good on the stump. He's not perfect, but he's okay. The question is whether that kind of turnout is going to occur or something like it, because the faction of Republican primary voters that vote for the so-called, they call them in that district liberty Republicans, right? These libertarian-leaning Republicans. Those voters always show up to vote. And they're definitely going to vote for Massie. They're definitely going to show up. And one of the reasons why Massie won his first primary back in 2012 and has been hard to beat ever since, not that it's been tried at this level, is that he's got an immovable, committed base of support. And usually in a primary like this, in this district in particular, turnout is particularly low. So we've seen signs of higher turnout across the state, according to the Kentucky Secretary of State. That might be helped by the Senate primary, even though Andy Barr is going to run away with it at this point. But that's when I say it comes down to turnout. It particularly comes down to, do all these non-liberty Republicans, these non-libertarians that are more of your traditional sort of Republican, but also very supportive of President Trump, are they going to show up in force? If they do, Massie's in trouble. If they don't, he can get by.
Yeah, it's interesting with Massie as compared to those Indiana state senators or even to Senator Cassidy, because I think part of the postmortem was it wasn't just Trump's support for opponents or opposition to incumbents. It was also a feeling among the electorate that these individuals were not fighting the fights that I expected them to fight, that I sent them to Washington or I sent them to Indianapolis to fight. And that's a little bit different with Massie, because he has picked some fights that base Republican libertarian voters wanted to see fought, including on COVID, for example. Same thing with Rand Paul, which is why he still enjoys, I think, generally speaking, good standing in Kentucky. So, if you just look at it through the Trump prism, I think perhaps you miss the complicating factor, that the texture of, he's had run-ins with Trump, but he's done X, Y, and Z. He's fought a lot of the right fights, even if I don't agree with every time he's disagreed with Trump. And that's different than maybe Cassidy could claim, or those Indiana state senators, certainly.
Well, I think that's true to a degree. I think you hit on a good point, and I was in Indiana a couple of weeks before I was in Kentucky to cover those state Senate races. And it's funny, the incumbents that were under threat were telling me that some of the most potent ads that were causing them the most problems, and of course, the majority of them ended up losing were ads having to do with China buying up Indiana farmland, and, things that they had not done to sort of burnish their conservative bona fides as voters think of it today. But I did talk to a lot of voters in Indiana who just basically said, well, Trump's against this guy. And if Trump's against this guy, then I'm against this guy. Because Trump, in a sense, is my signal for what is sufficiently Republican or conservative or a fighter or however you want to look at it. I think you're very correct to hone in on the fact that Massie's a complicated figure in this regard. Look, he was elected in part because he was going to go to Washington and fight the man. And he wasn't going to worry about what House Republican leadership had to say, and he wasn't going to worry about what the White House had to say or the media or anything else. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is most Republican voters now like the man. And House Republican leadership mostly does what Trump wants. Therefore, they want Massie to listen to House Republican leadership. So Massie really hasn't changed. But the Republican voters' perception of Washington for the time being has changed. And even though there are some issues on foreign policy and Israel in particular, and how he talks about Jews and American support for Israel is very suspect and in theory could cause him a problem in any Republican primary, what's really going on here is they wanted a fighter when the opponent prior was Barack Obama. They don't want a fighter if you're fighting against Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. They're just looking ahead to Texas. We have the same dynamic, a similar dynamic, not exactly the same, similar dynamic, it seems, with Cornyn that we had with Cassidy. And at least the last sort of group of polls I've seen on the race, it's been trending in the direction of Paxton in that race, too. So you may see Trump really run the table in terms of some of the political opponents in Congress that he has had within Republican ranks, as well as those who were recalcitrant at the state level to do what he wanted on the remap.
Yeah, if I were a betting man, I would just bet on Paxton because that's what I think is more likely to happen. I would say there's a couple of sort of some differences between Cassidy and Cornyn. Cassidy's original sin was voting to convict President Trump
impeach.
After that second impeachment because of the riot at the Capitol and all of that. That's why Trump went after Cassidy and for no other reason. Cornyn, he hasn't gone after per se, and even though Cornyn's been an occasional critic of Trump or been willing to, speak, his opinion about Trump's political standing at any given time, he never logged any of those votes. But what's going on with Cornyn is that he's out of fashion for what Republican voters want right now, right? When he was elected Texas Attorney General in 1998 and U.S. Senator in 2002, he was exactly the kind of sort of governing, genteel, erudite Republican that Republican primary voters really liked, especially, by the way, across the South. What they want now are no-hold-barred fighters who don't worry about legislating, don't worry about working with Democrats, and just bring it every day in that fashion. And Cornyn, that's just not who he is. And I think for Cornyn, it's more of an issue of being out of place for what the base of the party is looking for stylistically today.
Yeah, I think his future is additionally imperiled by the failure to move the SAVE Act, for example, even though that's not his primary responsibility, and the focus has more or less been on Thune and some of the holdouts in the Senate that are obvious with respect to the filibuster. But it speaks to the old guard of Republican senators are the ones who can't get done what should get done. 80% of the people support this. They can't get it done. And Cornyn sort of represents that in the minds of many, myself included to a large extent, sort of the cake-eating type of old guard Republican that we've tired of.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of that, right? And it's a question of do you work within the system and, make necessary compromises and, accept the limitation of institutions, or do you not? And where Republican voters are right now is, and by the way, Democratic voters are in the same place. I mean, I'm covering Democratic primaries, which I am. I don't want to hear about Senate rules. I don't want to hear about norms or values. I don't want to hear about 60 votes. I don't want to hear about 51 votes for that matter. I mean, Democratic voters expect Democrats in Congress to do things they literally don't have the numbers to do no matter what the rules are. Like
Right.
either you have a majority or you don't. And Republican voters are in many ways in the same place, although they do have small majorities, but particularly because the president is in favor of, of not being limited by any systems, and he is, communicating to Republican primary voters that things are possible that, may or may not be possible, and it sort of depends on, what the bill is and what the ramifications are. They're just expecting results, and they're not in a place where it's good enough to pass sort of they're not in a place where when you tell people you're governing, that's the answer, right? They want to hear that you are doing big, bold things that go beyond, often the scope of what's technically possible based on what the numbers are.
On the other side, I mean, you've heard the clips I played, and you've been, I'm sure, watching the same rhetorical offerings that I've been watching. So, do you expect that there'll be diminishing marginal returns to all this ghosts of the Confederacy, Jim Crow 2.0 business with respect to the Calais decision and the subsequent remapping?
I mean, it's kind of red meat that Democrats are throwing at their base, and their base will eat it up. I don't think that it necessarily matters one way or the other in a midterm election where everything's going to hinge on how people feel about the president and the issues that matters most to them, which, as usual, but in particular, is the economy and the cost of living this time around. These are the sorts of things that I think could be problematic for Democrats in 2028. Because if you're running for president as the nominee of your party as a Democrat in 2028, and you're in these swing states and you're throwing around Jim Crow 2.0 and things like that, can rub a lot of swing voters and independents and soft Republicans that you need to come over to your side, can rub them the wrong way, right? So, this time around, especially you're in a Democratic primary, it's primary season for them too, and you're saying a bunch of stuff that, your voters are going to eat up, and everything's all about the president in any event. 2028 is going to be a totally different story.
Speaking of 2028, is it still very muddled on that side, do you think? Or is there even sort of in the scuttlebutt outside of public earshot, is there some rank order prioritizing or threshold developing going on among those who are aspirants?
I think it's muddled. And I think, what most people, just because I'm paid to do this, don't realize is the Democrats are still having a very robust internal debate about whether they should be a center-left party or a left-wing party, whether they should, prioritize winning the states you need to win a general election, or whether or not, the old saw, what people want are big, bold ideas. So the leftier we are, I just made up that word, the leftier we are, the better. Mm-hmm. That's how you win, right? And I think that's a debate they are having internally. I think a lot of people are going to run for president on their side, and we will see who emerges. I mean, whether I've watched these Democratic primaries or Republican primaries over the years when they're open and crowded, there's always a sense of the person at the top of the polls or the most name ID at the moment. That's the one they're going to pick. And they often don't pick that person. Whether it's 2004, it wasn't Howard Dean, it ended up to be John Kerry. Whether it's 2016, it wasn't 25 Republicans, it was Donald Trump. Whether it was, 2008, it wasn't Hillary Clinton, it was Barack Obama. So, these things never usually end up the way people think they will. And I suspect that we're going to see a lot of that this time.
David Drucker, senior writer for The Dispatch, author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. David, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.
Annie, join us in the alphawealthgroup.com answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer. It's almost time once again for the annual AM 560 Golf Outing, presented by Signature Bank. AM